Hi guys, today I'm going to talk to you about lenses in terms of aperture and how they can be used to make your photography and filmmaking a little bit better. Alright, now I've already talked a little bit about ISO and increasing the light on the subject by increasing the ISO level, which adds significant little bits of grain to the image, so that's not necessarily good. But we can keep the sensor sensitivity quite low and actually have better light on a person by having a lens with a wider aperture. So the best way to explain this is actually to show you. So I've got here my SLR Magic Hyper Prime lens. Now you can see all the way through that, and that is because this lens has got an unusually high aperture. It's designed for micro four thirds. It's the SLR Magic's Hyper Prime 50mm lens, and I love this baby to bits. Now basically what we do is we can shut down the aperture like that and open it up again to change everything about the image which we're taking in. Right, now one of the things which will change with this is the depth of field of the image. So as you see, my hand in front of me is blurry, the shelf behind me is blurry, I am sort of not blurry, but I'm using a manual prime, so at points in the video I can go blurry when I come in and go out, that sort of thing. So what I've got here is a very shallow depth of field, and the more light that's coming into the lens, that's allowed into the lens, the shallower the depth of field, so it'll sort of squish down the brighter the image gets. And that can be quite useful in terms of fading out backgrounds, in terms of portrait photography, that sort of thing. Let me ask you a question. So what happens when we change our aperture? How's the light affected? Well, I'll give you an example. This lens has got a brightest aperture of 1.7, which is what I'm using now because it's easier to film indoors and shoot indoors with a wider aperture without having a massive amount of ISO on there. So what I'll do is I'll just drop down the aperture a little bit. Now we're going down quite deep, and as you can see in the background, it's becoming more and more and more into focus, and more into focus and more into focus. Now we can't really see me anymore, so I'll whap up the ISO a bit, and as you can probably see, the background is a lot more in focus. I can come in a lot closer and still be in focus. So basically, the wider your aperture is, the less you've got in terms of foreground and background focus, and you can change everything like so. You can focus on the background, focus on the foreground, focus on my hand, that sort of thing. And well, that's one of the reasons I like manual primes anyway. But basically the advantage of having a camera lens which has got a wider aperture is that you're going to get more initial light, and if you're using a cheap camera, the chances are your ISO settings will become very, very grainy very, very quickly, which is why having a very, very wide aperture lens on a cheap camera is a lot better than, say, having a very sort of tight lens on a cheap camera. That is if you want a natural indoor look. If you're just going for something that is that's basically, how do I put this? If you're going for something which is going to be using flash all the time, then the aperture of the lens doesn't really matter that much. But I would recommend, if you're going to go with a camera, say something even like, oh, where's my G5? There we go. We're going to go with something like the Lumix G5. The ISO is not particularly brilliant on this camera, so I would use a wider lens in there, such as this Canon lens which I've got attached using an adapter, and I've got an aperture of 1.8 on this, or I could use the lens which is on the camera to do on this camera to get a better aperture. Basically the inbuilt lens which originally comes with it, which is this little baby here. Oops, let's try and get you off. This one's got quite a closed aperture of 3.5. Now that isn't particularly brilliant when compared with some of the cheaper end camera lenses for the cheaper cameras which you get on the market. But the advantage is that lens has got glass, it's got clearer optics, it's got a lot more in terms of design and potential than, say, a lens on a cheap 50 quid camera that you can pick up. But basically, to cut a long story short, and I'm going to keep rambling because that's generally what I do, and it's very unhealthy in these videos, is the wider the aperture, the more light is being shone on the target, the better the camera is able to pick up everything in the room around them, and also the more there is a depth of field. So I'm going to say goodbye to you now with using the other thing, and we're going to fade off and just, yeah, into nothing.